We're able to register an account now, but we can't actually log in, so it's pretty pointless at the moment. But in this part, we're going to look at creating our login route, much like we did with the register route, so we should be pretty comfortable with that now. But we're also going to look at a few other things, and we're going to look at middleware. We're going to look at before middleware, so what happens before a request to our application. And this is the point where we're going to check if a session is set, and then we're going to create a slim container object that's going to represent our user, so we can check if a user is signed in. So let's start with the basics and create our view for our login and our route so we can actually see the page, and we'll go ahead and add it to our navigation, and then we will start to log the user in and we'll create all these other things along the way. So let's close everything off and just start fresh. We are going to create a new route under auth. Remember, that's where our register route is. So this is going to be our login route. So let's save this here as login.php. And of course, this is going to be app.get.login. And then we're going to render a view from here. So let's also name this as well so we don't forget and we don't see any errors. So we're going to call that login so we can reference that within our navigation easily. Okay, so let's create our view now. So remember, under auth, we have register. We'll put login next to this. So login.php, and we'll just say login page. And let's render that view from here. So remember, we do app render auth and then the name of the view. So that's login.php. So now when we visit login, of course, we need to add it to our routes file just here. So let's add that in there. And we have another error. So we see undefined variable app. So let's go back to our login route and just see. That's because we didn't allow app to be in that global under this scope. So that'll work now. So we've got our login page. So let's build up our login form then. Again, what we're going to be doing is just stealing the template from here. Remember, this extends the default template, so we'll just paste this in. We will have login as the title, and we'll have login here, and then we just see the following. So we get our title up here, we get our navigation as normal. And while we're at it, let's add to our navigation. So let's add login, and we'll say URL for login. Remember, we named that route there, login. So there we go. So we can now start to switch between these pages. So let's build the form. So under here, let's create a form. The action is going to be to URL for login.post, and we're going to have a method here of post, and we're going to turn autocomplete off. So we're going to do a similar thing to the what we did in the register view. We're going to have a label here for our email or our username. Now we're going to call this identifier, because what we're going to allow the user to do is either sign in with their username or their email. It doesn't matter what they provide, it will be looked up regardless. So I'm going to call this identifier. So in here we'll say username / email, and then we'll create our input here, type of text. This name is going to be identifier, and the ID will be identifier as well. So we have that. Now we need to ask the user for their password. So we can copy this, paste it in there, and we'll change this to password, change the label text to password, and change the type here to password, and these two as well. So the name and the ID. Okay, so then finally we have our submit button, which is just going to be an input of the type of submit, and the value is going to be login. So that's what the user is going to see. So we have the following, and the reason we get this error now, obviously, is because we don't have a login post route. So under our root file here, let's say app post login. We have our function, put app in this scope, and we'll name this login.post, and we'll say form posted. There we go. So we've got our routes complete. So let's now focus on actually posting the form and what we do within here, which is obviously just signing the user in. So what we want to do then is the same as we did with register. We want to pull in the app request object, which is going to give us the ability to pull in the identifier and the password. So let's call this identifier. And we'll say request post identifier. And we have the password. So the identifier that can either be the username or the email, and we have the user's password. So we want to validate this as well. So let's start validating now. So we're going to say v equals app validation. We'll say v validate. We'll pass in our validation rules here. So we have the identifier. This needs to be, or rather we pass in the data, and then this just needs to be required. We don't need to do any checking here because we're not inserting anything. And we have the password, which is also required. So if the validation passes, we can log the user in. We obviously need to check their password and things like that. Otherwise, down here, we want to render auth login. We want to pass in our errors again. So we pass errors through manually. And we want to pass in the request object as well, so we can grab the data that they've previously submitted. We don't have to add this to the form, but we can if we want, as long as we have request passed to our view. So now then, if we hit login, this is actually an error. So it's not doing anything, it's just passing us back without errors. So now let's update our view to actually give us them errors. So we do exactly the same thing as we did for registration. We say if errors first identifier, and we end that if there, and then we output errors first identifier. So let's check this. There we go. Identifier is required, and we can do the same thing for the password as well. Like so. And then if we submit with nothing, we get that. So let's not output the previous data for the identifier, or certainly not the password. We'll just leave this as it is, but you can feel free to add this in if you want to. Let's now focus on what happens if the validation does actually pass. So the first thing we want to do is look up the user where the identifier, which remember is the email or the username, is equal to the one that's been given. So we're going to say user equals app user, where username equals the identifier, or where, now this is getting a little bit long, so what I'm going to do is just pull this down onto the next line just so it's a little bit more readable. So I'm going to say where or email equals the identifier. So if I was to submit through to the form Alex, it would pick up this record because the username equals the identifier, and if I passed in tabby at codecourse.com, it would pull back this record because the email equals the identifier. So what we want to do from that is pull back the first record. And now what we can do is check, first of all, if a record has been found. If it hasn't been found, then we obviously can't log the user in, so we can't find the user's account. And we also want to check if the password matches as well. So the if statement here is going to be if user. So essentially, if this record can't be found, user will be null. So we need to make sure the user actually does exist. And app hash password check. Remember, that's the method that we implemented in our hash helper here to verify a password. So if they are both true, we obviously need to pass in the data here first of all. So we pass in the password that the user submitted up here, and we pass through the user's password, and we access that from this object by just passing in the password like that. So that will pull in this password hash, and it will compare it to the password that the user gave. If that's the case, we'll just say fine, and otherwise we'll kill the page down here and say error. So let's check this out. If I hit login, we obviously get these. So we can say alex at codecourse.com, which doesn't exist. Error. Tabby at codecourse.com, which does exist. I'm typing in the actual real password here. It's just the string password. We get fine. If I type in Alex, which is the username of this account, and I type in the correct password, we get fine. If I type in Alex and a rubbish password, we get error. So we know that this works now. We just need to, tidy this up and do something. Okay, so if the username or the email and password were not accepted, we can flash a message and redirect the user. So we're going to say else app flash global. We already know how the session flashing works. Could not log you in. And then we want to redirect the user. So we say app response redirect app URL for home. So we're just redirecting the user to the URL for the home route. So now if we just type in a load of rubbish, could not log you in. So that's fine. But if the user can be logged in, so if their password matches and that account exists, we want to set a session. So we're going to say session. Now, where do we get the session name from? Well, cast your mind back to the start of the series when we looked at configuration. We actually have in here auth session, so that's the name of the session. And all this allows us to do is easily change this if we want to, if we're using it elsewhere, which we probably will be doing. So we're going to say app config get auth.sessions. That's the session name. And we're going to assign that the value user ID, so that we're storing the user ID in that session. It's obviously secure because sessions are stored on our server, or as secure as it can be because sessions are being stored on our server. So this can't be accessed or modified by anyone. So once we've done that, we want to flash a message and redirect the user. So we're going to flash global. You are now signed in. And we will redirect as well. So app response redirect. Where do we want to redirect to? Well, we want to go to the URL for home again. So either way. Okay, so what we could do just to tidy this up is we could take this out, pull this in, get rid of this, and paste that down there. So all this is doing is flashing a certain message, but then after this if statement, we're just redirecting the user off. So that's all nice and tidied up. So now when I hit login, we see nothing. Type in a load of rubbish, could not log you in. We can type in a real username and password, and it now says you are now signed in. However, I've just noticed we're redirecting back to the home page when what we should really be doing is redirecting back to the login page. So let's just change that in there. There we go. Looks a lot nicer. Perfect. Okay, so now that we've done that then, we are actually setting a session. So let's just pull up our developer tools and go over to resources and over to cookies, localhost. We have PHP session ID. So this is the session ID for the current session we're using. This will be initiated when we do session start in start.php, which we've already done. But we know that we are setting a session anyway. So we're now actually technically logged in, but we're not doing anything about being logged in. So this is where things get a little bit more difficult in terms to understand if you're not familiar with middleware. So the middleware that we're going to be creating is going to be executed before every request to the application. And what that will allow us to do is modify the state of the application based on what happens in that middleware. So what we're going to do is under Codecourse, and let's just tidy this up so it's a little bit easier to read. So under Codecourse, we're going to create a new folder called Middleware. And what we do is we attach this to Slim. And like I said, this is run at any point in your application, either before or after the request to your application, and it modifies the current request. And all that means in the case for logging in is if the session is set here, so if we do have a session set, we want to turn the application into a state of being logged in. So let's create a before middleware, and we will be adding to this later on in the series, so it's a really useful thing to have here. So we're going to call this before middleware.php, and we're going to namespace this under Codecourse middleware. And if this doesn't make sense at all, it will do at some point. So we're going to say class before middleware. And we need to extend middleware. Now, what is middleware? Well, this doesn't exist at the moment. What we need to do is import slim middleware like that. So this now extends it. So we have a method in here called call, which is run when this middleware is used. So we're going to say call. We can test this out just by echoing hello. And then all we do is we run the next request or forward this onto the next request. So we say this next call. So all this will do now is when we attach it to our app, it'll echo hello before every request, which obviously isn't what we want. It's that silly. So how do we attach this middleware to our app? Well, under start, what we can do is after we define slim, we can say app add, and then we say new Codecourse middleware before middleware. Now, I don't like this, so what I'm going to do is just going to get rid of this. I'm going to say new before middleware, and up here I'm going to say use Codecourse middleware before middleware, like that. So we've added that middleware to our application. Let's see what happens. So when I hit enter, we see hello. When I go on to the next page, so this is really pointless at the moment. But what our middleware is actually intended to do is before every request, we want to check if that session is set, and then like I said, set authentication on. So we want to say that the user is authenticated. But we need to start out with a state of the user not being authenticated. And we're going to add this as or basically to our container. So what we're going to do is we're going to say app auth equals false. That's all we're going to do. So this is adding this auth to the container, which is currently false. And that means what we can do is elsewhere in our application, say something like if app auth. Just a really easy way to check. Now, if app auth is true or not false, then we have a user object attached to this auth, which means that we can grab information then about the currently signed in user. And again, if this doesn't make too much sense, don't worry. We'll be demonstrating this in just a minute when we update our navigation to welcome the user. So we'll see this in action. So over to our before middleware then. What we need to do is hook on a method to run within this class to be run before every request to our application. You don't need to do this, but it just makes things a little bit tidier. So we're going to say this app hook, not app hook. So this app hook, slim.before, so before the request to every application. We want to run a method on this class, and that method is going to be run. So we can create a new method here called run, and that's going to run a request before everything to our application. So hello, and then it does exactly the same thing. So we can now put the functionality in here to check if a user is authenticated. So this might seem like a really long-winded way of doing things, but it just means that you're separating the parts of your application that do certain things into smaller chunks, which make life a lot easier when you need to go and update them. You don't have to go through lots of code. So the check then to see if a user is authenticated is checking if that session is set. So we just say if is set $_session. We need to provide the session name, which remember comes from our configuration. So this app config get auth.session. So if that is set, user is authenticated. So how do we override this authenticated state? Remember, in start.php auth is false, so all we need to do is set this auth equal to getting that user record. So we need to pull that user in. This will store all of the information about them in this auth, and then we can use that anywhere. So we just say this app user, that's our user model. We use the query builder to build up this, and we're going to say where the ID is equal to, and then the session name again, which we can just steal straight from here again. So let's pull this, paste that in there, and there we go. So this will return the user record where the ID equals the ID from the session. It will store it in auth. Auth here will no longer be false, and we now have something attached to our container that we can use. So let's take a look at how this works. So I've refreshed the page. Auth will now be my user account. So to test this out, we can do down here var dump on app auth. So I guess we can try and var dump this inside of here to see what's going on. Okay, so that seems to be working there. We're getting that out. Oh, of course. So the reason this isn't working is inside of start, we're doing this just here. And this is before the app is run. Now the app is run at the point when we hit index.php here. So the only option we have just to test this out very quickly is to say app auth here, because run will run that middleware in the order that we need. So now we see the following. So we've got this at the bottom of the page. We've got our user out there. So what we could do is we could say app author username. And this isn't going to work, and we'll see why. So undefined property. And in before middleware, what we're doing is we're pulling in this record, but we're not grabbing the first record. So if we just add that in, that will pull back the first record. So we now see string Alex, we're signed in as Alex. So after all that, then hopefully that will make sense now. It's always a little tricky to try and understand these things, let alone debug them. But we're now good to go. What we can do now is start to update things, and we're going to start with the navigation. So under views, partials, navigation, if the user is signed in, we do not want to show register and login because they don't need to log in and they don't need to register. So how do we know if the user is signed in or not? Well, ideally what we want to do is something like the following. If auth show something or else hide something. But we don't have auth available in our views. So what we need to look at is sharing data or appending data to views. And we can do this in our before middleware. So down here, what we can do is say this app view append data. And we can pass in an array of data that we want to share with views. This is going to be auth this app auth, like we just output a minute ago. So now we have this auth value from our container, which is either false if the user isn't signed in, or an object if the user is signed in all of our views. This will share it with all of our views. So now that we've got that, under navigation, we can say something like if auth else, and we can wrap these in that else, and if. So in here, we'll just say logged in or something. And there we go. So we get logged in like that. There we go. We're signed in. We can't register or log in. We technically can go to register, but we're going to be preventing that a bit later. So what we're going to focus on then is if auth, we're not going to do anything. But what we are going to do at the top of here is we're going to output to the user their name. So we need to update our user model to provide us with an easy way to get the user's full name, or if they don't have a full name, just get their username. So to start with, let's say if auth hello username, and let's just put this in a paragraph like so. So there we go. So hello username. Now we could obviously just say something like auth.username. So that would work like so. Because remember, we are pulling auth is now our user object or our user model. So we can just pull the values from it. But we want to update our model to output our first and last name. Or if that doesn't exist, or either or don't exist, we'll output our username. So let's update this then. And we are going to implement a method to get the full name, first of all. So we're going to call this get full name. And all this does is checks if this, referring to the current state of the model when we use it, first name. So if no first name or no last name, return null, so we return nothing, or we could return false. Otherwise, we want to return this first name, a space, and then this last name. That's it. So get full name will now get the user's full name. So we can add this just quickly to test here. We can say get full name. We get null because we don't have a name. So let's just very quickly update this. And there we see the full name. But what we want to implement now is a method to get the full name or the username if the full name isn't available. So get full name or username. So that's obviously a method. And all we're going to do is return this get full name. Now, if the full name doesn't exist, or, well, we return null, which is what we're doing if it doesn't exist, then we're going to output this username. All this means is output this value if it's there, otherwise output this. That's what that means. So what we can now do is test this get full name or username method on our navigation. So get full name or username. We obviously see our full name, but if we don't have a first name or last name, let's null these, then we see our username. And we're going to be using this throughout the app. It's going to be really useful to be able to do this because, for example, if you're sending an email to a user, you might want to address them by their full name, which is polite, or you might want to address them by their username, but you can switch between them with this method. So, although that was a little bit long-winded, we now have the ability to sign in to our account. We've learned about middleware and why we created it, to check if that session's set and then update the state of our app. We've shared data with our view, which we can then use to check within our navigation if the user is authenticated, and we can output a little message to them. And then we've wrapped this somewhat within our navigation to output register and login only if the user isn't authenticated. So we're not going to be looking at logging out just yet. What we're going to do in the next video is go on to setting up email so we can actually send email. So we're going to send an email when the user registers. That's just going to drop them an email and say you have created a new account. And we're going to do this using PHP Mailer, but we're going to create our own wrapper to be able to send email. So pretty long-winded, but this is going to mean that inside of our app, we're going to be able to send email in a really nice way.